The silence of the high plains was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that Jacob Vance had come to know better than any man. It pressed in on him at dawn when the first sliver of sun bled over the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, and it settled over his small ranch like a shroud when the last of the light was swallowed by the vast, star-pricked darkness. For 3 years, since the fever had taken his Sarah, this silence had been his only constant companion. It was a cruel and hollow bedfellow. Jacob was a man carved from the very land he worked. His hands were gnarled and calloused. Maps of barbed wire fences strung, calves pulled, and 1,000 other relentless chores that made up a life wrested from the unforgiving Arizona soil. His face, weathered by a sun that knew no mercy and winds that carried the grit of the desert, was a mask of stoic resolve. But behind his pale blue eyes, a storm of memory and loneliness raged. He saw Sarah in the shimmering heat rising from the baked earth, heard her laugh in the frantic squeak of the windmill's vane, felt her absence in the cold half of the bed he never touched. His ranch was modest, a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, a barn that leaned just enough to have character, a corral, and a few dozen head of cattle that were more stubborn than profitable. It was enough. It had been their dream, his and Sarah's. Now, it was his prison, each fence post and field stone a monument to what he had lost. He spoke more to his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Jericho, than to any human soul. Weeks could pass without him riding the 2 hours into the dusty settlement of Harmony Creek, and when he did, his conversations were clipped transactions for flour, salt, and coffee. The townsfolk knew him as the widower Vance, a man who kept to himself, wrapped in a grief as vast and empty as the sky above his land. The decision, when it finally solidified, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. It came to him one evening as he sat on his porch, watching the sky burn itself out in strokes of violent orange and purple. The loneliness was a physical ache in his chest, a hunger that food couldn't satisfy. He was 32 years old, and the prospect of facing another 30 or 40 years of this crushing silence was a fate worse than death. He didn't crave love. He believed that part of his heart had been buried with Sarah, but he craved companionship. The simple human warmth of another presence in the cabin, the sound of a voice that wasn't his own echo. He'd seen the advertisement in a tattered copy of the Matrimonial Times left behind at the general store. Mail-order brides, honorable women seeking devoted husbands to build a life in the West. It had seemed a desperate, pathetic notion at first, something for men who couldn't find a wife the proper way. But what was the proper way out here, where the cattle outnumbered the women 10 to 1? He wasn't a man for courting or dances. He was a man of the earth, and the earth was silent. So, with hands that felt clumsy and foreign holding a pen, he wrote a letter. He didn't embellish. He described his small ranch, his solitude, his need for a partner and helpmeet. He enclosed a photograph of himself, looking grim and sun-scorched. Standing before his cabin, he expected no reply. A month later, a reply came. The envelope was thin, the handwriting within as delicate as a spider's web. It was from a woman named Evelyn Reed. Her words were proper, almost formal. Yet beneath the careful calligraphy, Jacob could feel a deep and profound weariness, a sorrow that seemed to seep through the very paper. "Mr. Vance," she wrote, "I have received your correspondence. I am a woman of simple habits and quiet disposition, skilled in the domestic arts and not afraid of hard work. I have faced hardship and am seeking not riches, but a new beginning where the past holds no claim. I have no family to speak of, and your honest description of a quiet life is one that I find myself drawn to. If you will have me, I will be a faithful and diligent wife." She enclosed no photograph. There was something in the turn of her phrases, where the past holds no claim, no family to speak of, that resonated with his own solitude. It wasn't the letter of a hopeful young girl seeking adventure, but of a soul that had been bruised. He read it over and over, the elegant script a stark contrast to his own rough existence. He found himself drawn to the mystery of her, to the sadness he could read between the lines. He sent the money for her stagecoach ticket without a second thought. As the day of her arrival neared, a strange current of unease rippled through Harmony Creek. Talk in the saloon and over the counter at the general store wasn't just about the price of beef or the lack of rain. It was darker. Whispers of women disappearing from outlying homesteads, of travelers who never reached their destination. There were rumors of whisper men, shadowy figures who preyed on lone women, luring them with promises of work or passage, only for them to vanish. Some said they were sold to work in saloons in distant mining camps. Others whispered of fates far worse. The law, in the form of the aging and overwhelmed Sheriff Brody, had no answers, only warnings for folks to be wary of strangers. Jacob tried to dismiss it as saloon gossip, the kind of fear that festers in isolated communities. Yet, it settled in the back of his mind like a burr under a saddle blanket. He was bringing a woman he'd never met, a woman with no family to look for her, into this very wilderness. The thought was disquieting. Was he providing a sanctuary, or leading her into a different kind of trap? The day the stagecoach was due, Jacob rode into town feeling a nervousness he hadn't felt in years. He'd scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, aired out the small spare room that would be hers, and even bought a small pot of geraniums from the store owner's wife, a clumsy attempt to soften the harshness of the place. He tied Jericho to the hitching post outside the stagecoach station, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The coach arrived in a cloud of dust and a jangle of tired harnesses. A few dusty salesmen and a weary-looking family disembarked, and then she appeared. She stepped down from the coach, her hand clutching a small, worn carpet bag. She was slighter than he'd imagined, almost fragile, swallowed by a plain, dark gray traveling dress that had seen better days. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned up neatly beneath a simple bonnet, but a few stray strands had escaped to frame a pale, heart-shaped face. She wasn't beautiful in the way Sarah had been, with her rosy cheeks and ready smile. This woman was a watercolor painting left out in the rain, her colors muted, her edges softened by some unseen sorrow. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were the color of a storm-clouded sky, large and deep, and they held a history he couldn't read. There was fear in them, yes, but also a profound exhaustion, a guarded stillness that made him feel like a clumsy intruder. She scanned the small crowd, her gaze passing over him once before flicking back, her brow furrowing slightly. He stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Reed?" His own voice sounded rough, unused. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Vance." Her voice was low and soft, barely a whisper against the noise of the town. In that moment, standing before her, Jacob felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart give a heavy, unfamiliar lurch. He had expected to feel a sense of duty, perhaps even pity. He had not expected to feel this sharp, sudden jolt of something, a protective instinct, a flicker of profound curiosity. Her quiet, wounded dignity struck him more powerfully than any great beauty could have. "Welcome to Harmony Creek," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He reached for her bag. "Allow me." She flinched, a tiny, reflexive motion, as his fingers brushed hers. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her eyes widening for a second before the mask of composure fell back into place. "Thank you," she murmured, letting him take the bag. The ride back to the ranch was steeped in a thick, awkward silence. Jacob pointed out landmarks, the San Pedro River, a distant mesa, more to fill the quiet than for any other reason. Evelyn sat ramrod straight on the wagon seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The landscape of the west unfolded around them, raw and magnificent. The sun began its slow descent, setting the sky on fire, The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and dry sagebrush. A lone coyote yipped in the distance, its call a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the feeling in the wagon. Jacob tried to draw her out, his questions gentle. "The journey was long, I imagine." "It was," she answered, her voice flat. "Have you ever been this far west before?" "No." He tried again. "My ranch, it isn't much, but it's sturdy. The well is deep." She simply nodded, her eyes not leaving the horizon. Every question about her home, her family, or her life before the letter was met with a polite but firm wall of silence. She was a closed book, its cover beautiful but its pages sealed shut. He found himself growing frustrated, but also intrigued. What was she running from that was so terrible she couldn't even speak its name? When they finally crested the last rise and his small homestead came into view, the cabin a dark silhouette against the bleeding sky, a single lamp glowing yellow in the window, he saw her shoulders relax by the barest of margins. "This is it," he said quietly. "Home." She looked at the small, isolated cabin, the vast, empty land stretching out in every direction, and for the first time, a flicker of an unreadable emotion crossed her face. It wasn't happiness or relief. It was something closer to resignation. The relationship inside the cabin was as stark and spare as the landscape outside. Jacob showed her to the small room he had prepared. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small wooden chest. Her eyes swept over it, lingering on the pot of red geraniums on the windowsill. "It's clean," she said, and he couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a simple observation. "It's yours," he replied. "This house, I hope you'll come to see it as yours too." She gave him a quick, nervous glance, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "My name is Jacob." She nodded, but didn't repeat it. That first supper was an exercise in tension. The scraping of forks against tin plates was deafening in the silence. He was acutely aware of her every movement. The way she held her fork, the way she carefully folded her napkin, the way she kept her eyes fixed on her plate. She moved with a practiced stillness, a self-effacing grace that suggested she was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. He felt like a clumsy bear in her presence. He, who was so comfortable in the vast emptiness of the plains, felt confined and awkward within the four walls of his own home. There was a chasm between them, wider and deeper than any canyon. When the meal was done, she stood and began to clear the plates without a word. "I can do that," he said, rising. "It is a wife's duty," she replied, her back to him. The word wife hung in the air between them, feeling alien and untrue. "Evelyn," he began, but he didn't know how to finish. He wanted to tell her that he didn't want a servant, that he wanted a partner, but the words wouldn't come. She seemed to be surrounded by an invisible wall, and he had no idea how to breach it. She finished washing the dishes, her movements economical and precise, and then excused herself. "I am very tired from the journey. If you'll permit me, I will retire for the evening." "Of course," he said, watching her disappear into the small room and quietly close the door. He sat alone in the main room for a long time, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the weight of all the things she wasn't saying. He felt more alone than he had before she arrived. Later, as he lay in his own bed, the familiar ghost of Sarah beside him. He heard it, a sound so faint he at first thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the window frame. He held his breath, listening. It came again, the thin, broken sound of weeping. It was utterly silent, controlled, as if she were smothering the sobs in her pillow, desperate for no one to hear. She thought he was asleep. She thought she was alone in her grief. Jacob lay perfectly still, his fists clenched at his sides, Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer some small comfort, but he didn't. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his comfort would not be welcome. She was a wild, wounded creature, and the slightest move might send her bolting. So he lay there in the dark, a silent witness to her hidden sorrow, and listened as the woman who was his wife cried alone in the next room. The mystery of Evelyn Reed had just begun, and its first chapter was written in tears. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Evelyn was the first to rise, long before the sky had begun to pale. When Jacob entered the main room from his own small bedroom, the cabin was already warm, the scent of fresh coffee and frying bacon a welcome ghost from a life he thought was long past. She moved through the space with a quiet efficiency that was both remarkable and unnerving. The floors were swept, the tin plates from the night before were scrubbed and stacked, and a sense of order had begun to impose itself on his bachelor existence. She was not afraid of work. In fact, she seemed to crave it, as if the relentless motion of her hands could quiet the turmoil in her mind. She learned to milk their lone cow, her touch surprisingly gentle and firm, coaxing more from the stubborn animal than Jacob usually bothered to. She took over the small vegetable garden that had been Sarah's pride, and which he had let fall into a sad state of neglect. He would watch her from the porch, her slight figure bent over the earth, pulling weeds with a fierce determination. Her hands, which he'd noticed were slender and pale upon her arrival, slowly becoming chapped and dusted with the red soil of his land. She spoke little, but her actions were a language he was beginning to understand. Each swept floor, each mended shirt, each warm meal was a word in a sentence that said, "I am earning my keep, I am trying." She even insisted on helping in the barn, the first time he'd found her there, attempting to heave a bale of hay, her face strained with effort. He had rushed to take it from her. "That's too heavy for you," he'd said, his voice gruffer than he intended. She had recoiled, not from his tone, but from his proximity, her ever-present shield falling into place. "I must contribute, Mr. Vance." "Jacob," he reminded her, his voice softer this time. "And you contribute plenty. The house, it hasn't felt this much like a home in a long time." The compliment seemed to startle her. She looked at him, her gray eyes wide and searching, as if trying to find a hidden meaning in his words. Then she simply nodded and turned back to her work, leaving him feeling as though he'd reached across a canyon only to have his hand met with empty air. A fortnight after her arrival, their supply of flour ran low, and Jacob knew he could no longer put off the trip to Harmony Creek. He asked if she would like to accompany him, thinking the change of scenery might do her good. The look of quiet panic that flashed across her face was his answer. I think it best I remain here," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "There is much to be done." He didn't press her. He rode into town alone, a list she had written in her perfect, delicate script tucked into his pocket, the moment he tied Jericho to the hitching post outside the general store. He felt the eyes on him. Harmony Creek was a small town, and gossip was its primary currency. Martha, the storekeeper's wife, a woman with a kind heart but a relentlessly curious nature, was the first. "Jacob Vance," she said, a broad smile on her face. "Been a while. Heard you got company." "I've taken a wife," Jacob stated plainly, meeting her gaze without flinching. Her eyebrows shot up. "A wife? Well, for goodness sake, where did you find her? Nobody's seen you courting." "She came from the east," he said, keeping his answer vague. He handed her the list. As she gathered his supplies, she leaned over the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You be careful, Jacob, with all this talk of women going missing, and these mail-order arrangements. You never know what kind of trouble you're buying. Some of these women, they're running from something fierce." His jaw tightened. "She's a good woman. Martha, hard-working and quiet." His defense did little to quell the whispers. Later, as he was leaving, he overheard a pair of old ranchers talking by the door. "That's Vance," one of them muttered. "The one who bought himself a woman through the mail. A desperate man'll do a desperate thing." The other spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "More like a foolish one. Bet she's got a past as long as the San Pedro River. Probably robs him blind and is gone in a month." Jacob's hand went to the hilt of the Colt peacemaker that rested on his hip. A purely instinctual reaction, but he let it go. Brawling in the street wouldn't help Evelyn. It would only feed the fire. He loaded his supplies, his face a granite mask, and rode out of town, the ignorant and cruel words of the townsfolk ringing in his ears. The ride home was long, the anger in his gut a hot, bitter coal. He was angry at them for their judgment, but he was also angry at himself. He had brought her here, into this isolated life, only to expose her to a different kind of cruelty. He had offered her a sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary surrounded by wolves. When he looked at her that evening, serving him the stew she had made, he saw her not just as a mysterious woman with a hidden past, but as a person of immense and quiet strength. He saw the patience in the way she moved, the gentleness in the way she treated his animals, and the silent, uncomplaining way she endured this life she had been thrown into. He saw the dignity with which she faced her invisible demons and the very visible judgment of the world, and his heart, which had been a cold, dormant thing for 3 years, began to feel a slow, painful, and undeniable thaw. He was beginning to care for this woman, not out of duty, but out of a deep and growing admiration. The change in the weather came a week later. The sky, which had been a relentless, bleached blue for months, began to bruise with clouds. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with the electric promise of rain. Jacob was out checking the fences on the far side of his property when he saw her walking, a small figure against the vast, dramatic landscape. He rode Jericho over to her. "It's going to break soon," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the darkening horizon. "You should be back at the cabin." She looked up at the sky, a strange, wistful expression on her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered, as if to herself. "So much space." He understood. After a life he could only imagine had been confining, this terrifying emptiness was, to her, a form of freedom. On impulse, he said, "Come on, I'll show you something." He extended his calloused hand to her. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from his hand to his face. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then, slowly, she placed her small, work-roughened hand in his. Her touch was light, tentative. He easily swung her up behind him on Jericho's saddle. He felt her tense as he urged the horse forward, her body held stiffly, a respectable distance between them. He rode them to the highest point of his land, a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the entire valley. The wind was picking up, whipping stray strands of her honey-colored hair across his cheek. The smell of ozone and rain-soaked creosote was sharp in the air. Below them, the plains stretched out, a tapestry of muted greens and browns, all under the brooding, purple belly of the storm. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. He felt her flinch, a sharp, involuntary movement, and her hands, which had been resting lightly on the back of the saddle, suddenly gripped his waist. It was the first time she had willingly touched him with such firmness. "It's all right," he said, his voice low. "It's just thunder." He felt her take a shaky breath, and then something shifted. The tension seemed to drain out of her. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward, resting her head against his broad back. Her bonnet had fallen away, and he could feel the warmth of her cheek through the thin cotton of his shirt. The gesture was so simple, so unexpected, and yet so profound. It was not the gesture of a wife, nor of a lover. It was the gesture of a weary traveler who had finally found a safe place to rest, if only for a moment. He sat perfectly still, the horse shifting beneath them, his heart hammering against his ribs, and simply let her be. He felt a fierce, protective surge, a desire to shield this fragile woman from the storm that was coming. and from all the storms she had already endured. That night, the storm broke with a vengeance. Rain lashed against the cabin, and lightning lit up the dark room in stark, instantaneous flashes, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. They sat in the main room, the only light coming from the flickering oil lamp and the fire in the hearth. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was different now. It was a shared silence, a comfortable space created by the storm that raged outside, enclosing them in their small, warm sanctuary. Jacob was looking into the fire, lost in thought, when he felt a small movement beside him. He turned his head. Evelyn was looking at him, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes holding a depth of emotion he had never seen before. She slowly lifted her hand and, with a touch as light as a moth's wing, placed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the slight tremor in her fingers, could feel the warmth of her palm seeping through his shirt. Beneath her hand, his heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm. She looked down at her hand, then back up at his face. Her lips parted slightly. "I don't know if I deserve this," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. This quiet, this kindness, his own past, his own grief, his loneliness, it all seemed to fall away in that moment. All that existed was this woman and her profound, heartbreaking vulnerability. He didn't have the words to tell her that she deserved all that and more. So he showed her. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't move. Her eyes fluttered shut as he gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her soft skin. He touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness, a quiet promise. Her lips were soft, hesitant, and they trembled slightly beneath his. It was a kiss that tasted of sorrow and rain and the faintest glimmer of hope. When he pulled back, her eyes were still closed, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. In that moment, surrounded by the storm, a fragile connection had been forged between them, delicate and new, yet feeling as elemental as the rain itself. But the peace was short-lived. The kiss had opened a door, but it had also unlocked a cage. In the nights that followed, the nightmares began. He would wake to the sound of her voice, a muffled, terrified whimper from her room. Sometimes she would cry out, a sharp, panicked "No!" that cut through the silence of the cabin. One night, he heard a crash. He rushed to her door, his heart pounding, calling her name. "Evelyn, are you all right?" There was a long silence. Then her shaky voice from within. I am fine. Jacob, I knocked over the water pitcher. I'm sorry to have woken you." He knew she was lying. He stood outside her door for a long time, his hand raised as if to knock again, but he let it fall. He felt utterly helpless. This fragile peace they had found was being besieged by the ghosts of her past, and he had no weapons to fight them. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. He had been mending a bridle on the porch, and he'd taken off the simple gold band he'd inherited from his father, the ring Sarah had placed on his finger on their wedding day, so as not to scratch it. When he was done, he went to put it back on, but it wasn't on the porch rail where he'd left it. A mild annoyance turned to cold panic. The ring was one of the few tangible things he had left of his past, of Sarah. He searched the porch, the yard, and then the cabin, his search growing more frantic. He looked under his bed, behind the stove, everywhere. Evelyn was out in the garden, as a last, desperate resort, thinking it might have rolled into her room. He went inside. Her room was, as always, immaculate. Her few belongings were neatly stored in the wooden chest. Her bed was perfectly made. He ran his hand under the bed, finding nothing but dust. He checked the washstand. Nothing. Then his eyes fell on the pillow. It seemed a foolish place, but he was desperate. He lifted it. Beneath it, lying flat on the mattress, was a small, cloth-bound notebook. It was no bigger than his hand, its blue cover faded and worn smooth at the edges. It was clearly not his. It could only be hers. A jolt went through him. This was her secret. This was the source of the nightmares, the reason for the walls she built around herself. His first instinct was to put the pillow back, to pretend he'd never seen it. It was a violation of her privacy, of the fragile trust that had begun to grow between them. He turned to leave, but the memory of her muffled cries in the night stopped him. The memory of her hand on his chest, her whisper of not deserving kindness. He was torn between the man who respected her privacy and the man who was beginning to love her and feared for what was hurting her so deeply. His hands shaking slightly, he picked up the book. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with unspoken words. He sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the book in his hands, his heart thudding a guilty rhythm. Just the first page, he told himself. Just to understand. He opened the cover. The first page was filled with that same delicate, perfect handwriting from her letters. But this was different. The words were cramped, hurried, as if written in fear of being discovered. He began to read. October 3rd. Another day in this house. He calls it our sanctuary, a haven blessed by the Almighty. I call it a cage. He watches my every move. His eyes are always on me, even when I think I am alone. He says it is the gaze of a loving husband protecting his wife. But it does not feel like love. It feels like ownership. I am a bird he has caught, and he has clipped my wings so thoroughly I have forgotten what the sky looks like. October 5th. He was angry today. I spoke to the delivery boy for too long. My punishment was silence. He did not speak to me for the rest of the day, but his presence was louder than any shout. Tonight, I will be expected to perform my duties. The thought fills me with a cold dread that settles deep in my bones. I pray for sleep, but I fear the darkness. I fear him. Jacob stopped reading, his blood running cold. Husband, cage, punishment. The words painted a picture so stark and horrifying that he felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just sadness she was running from. It was terror. He looked up from the page, his gaze unfocused, seeing not the simple walls of her room, but the invisible bars of the prison she had escaped. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had only just scratched the surface of her darkness. Jacob's hands trembled as he forced himself to turn the page. The neat, controlled script seemed a stark contradiction to the chaos and fear bleeding from the words themselves. He felt like a trespasser, a peeping Tom gazing into the window of a soul in torment. But he could not stop. He had to know. He had to understand the source of the shadows in her storm-gray eyes. November 12th. I was married at 17. My father, a man who found more solace in the bottom of a bottle than in his own family, sold me to Jedediah Kane for the price of his debts. Jedediah is twice my age, a pillar of his community, a man who speaks of scripture and salvation. He told me he would save my soul, but it is my body and my will that he seeks to own. The first time he laid his hands on me, he quoted verses about a wife's submission. He said the pain was a purification, a burning away of my youthful vanity. Jacob's breath hitched. He looked at the closed door to Evelyn's room, a flimsy barrier of wood that suddenly seemed to hold back a world of horrors. Jedediah Kane. The name sounded severe. Old Testament. He could almost picture the man, tall, gaunt, with eyes that burned with a cold, righteous fire. He continued to read, the entries becoming more fragmented, more desperate. December 1st. He has forbidden me from speaking unless spoken to. He says a woman's silence is her greatest virtue. My world has shrunk to the size of this house. The windows are my only view of a life I am no longer a part of. Sometimes, he makes me stand in the corner for hours, for a perceived slight, a dish not washed to his satisfaction, a glance that he deemed impertinent. He says it is to teach me humility. I feel myself disappearing. I am becoming a ghost in my own life. January 20th. The cellar. He took me to the cellar for the first time tonight. I had forgotten to mend a tear in his coat. He said a careless wife was an invitation to sin. He locked me in the dark. It is cold down here, and I can hear the skittering of rats in the walls. The smell of damp earth is suffocating. He has left me with no lamp. He said the darkness would force me to look inward, to confront my own wickedness. But the only wickedness I feel is his. He is the darkness. A wave of nausea rolled over Jacob. He pictured Evelyn, his Evelyn, the quiet woman who tended his garden with such gentle hands, locked in a dark, cold cellar, a protective fury, so hot and potent it almost blinded him, surged through his veins. He wanted to find this Jedediah Cain, this monster cloaked in piety, and tear him apart with his bare hands. He gripped the small book so tightly his knuckles turned white, the fragile cover creaking in protest. He forced himself to read on, drawn deeper into her nightmare. The entries described a life of systematic degradation. She wrote of being tied to the bedposts, of being deprived of food for days as punishment, of having her books and letters burned because her husband claimed they filled her head with worldly thoughts. It was a meticulous account of a spirit being deliberately and cruelly broken. He wasn't just a husband. He was a jailer, a torturer, and she was his solitary prisoner. Then he reached the final entries. The handwriting grew shakier. The ink smudged in places as if by tears or a trembling hand. March 10th. I think he means to kill me. He spoke last night of the final purification, of a wife's ultimate sacrifice. His eyes had a strange light in them. He said that soon. I would be with the angels, my soul finally cleansed by his hand. I am no longer just a prisoner. I am a lamb waiting for the slaughter. I must get away. But how? The doors are locked, the windows barred. He watches me always. March 13th. It is done. He is dead. It happened so fast. He came to my room tonight, a length of rope in his hand and that terrible, serene smile on his face. He said my time had come. Something inside me, something I thought had died long ago, broke free. I fought. I don't remember it all clearly. A struggle, the heavy candlestick by the bed, a terrible sound. When it was over, there was stillness. He was on the floor, his eyes open and empty. There was blood on my hands, on the front of my nightgown, red and stark, but I'm not sure whose. His? Mine? I cannot think. I cannot breathe. I took what little money he kept in his desk and I ran. I ran into the night, and I did not look back. Jacob closed the diary, his heart a block of ice in his chest. The fury was still there, a white-hot rage on Evelyn's behalf. But now, it was tainted by a new and chilling emotion, suspicion. He had fought men before. He knew the frenzy of a struggle, the blinding instinct to survive. He knew what it took to kill a man. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor and occasional violence. Then he thought of hers, so slender and seemingly fragile. Had those hands swung the candlestick? Had she, in a final act of desperate self-preservation, taken the life of her tormentor? He wanted to believe it was self-defense. Every decent part of him screamed that she was the victim, that any action she took was justified. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout ugly, tangled roots. I'm not sure whose, she had written. Was that the confusion of a traumatized mind, or the careful words of someone creating an alibi? Even to herself, she had run. She hadn't called for the law. She had taken his money and fled, eventually answering the advertisement of a lonely man hundreds of miles away, a man living in a place so isolated no one would ever think to look for her. He was caught in a terrible limbo, torn between a profound, aching pity and a cold, creeping fear. The woman he was growing to care for, the woman who had rested her head on his back, who had touched his heart with her quiet sorrow, might be a killer. He carefully placed the diary back under the pillow, his movement stiff and unnatural. He found his ring a moment later on the floor by the porch door. where it must have fallen. But the relief of finding it was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of the secret he now carried. When Evelyn came in from the garden, her cheeks flushed from the sun, he couldn't meet her eyes. He busied himself at the hearth, pretending to stoke a fire that didn't need it. "Did you find your ring?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yes," he said, his own voice sounding distant, foreign. It was on the floor. He could feel her watching him. He chanced a glance. She was standing by the table, her head tilted slightly, her brow furrowed in a look of concern. She saw it. She saw the change in him. It was in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, the invisible wall that had suddenly been rebuilt between them, thicker and higher than before. The rest of the day passed in a strained, humming silence. Every time he looked at her, he saw not just Evelyn, but the ghost of her past. He saw her cowering in a cellar. He saw her fighting for her life, and he saw her standing over a dead body with blood on her hands. When she handed him his plate at supper, he couldn't help but stare at her fingers, imagining them gripping a heavy brass candlestick. She noticed his gaze and quickly pulled her hand back, a flicker of hurt and confusion in her eyes. That evening, the air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken words. The oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar space feel claustrophobic and strange. Evelyn sat at the table, mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. Jacob sat across from her, oiling a piece of leather tack, the repetitive motion a poor distraction for his racing mind. He wanted to ask. The questions were a physical pressure in his throat, choking him. Who was he? What did he do to you? What happened that night? But he couldn't form the words. To ask would be to admit he had invaded her most private thoughts. It would be an accusation, a judgment, and what if she confessed? What would he do then? The silence stretched, pulled taut between them, a string about to snap. He looked up and found her watching him, her mending forgotten in her lap. Her eyes were wide and vulnerable in the lamplight, and they held a question of their own. What is it? What have I done wrong now? The look on her face was a knife in his gut. He was behaving just like her tormentor, punishing her with silence, his judgment a palpable force in the room. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Evelyn flinched. "I'm turning in," he muttered, not looking at her, and strode toward his room. He lay in his bed, the darkness a suffocating blanket, his mind a maelstrom. He heard her move about the main room, banking the fire, blowing out the lamp. He heard the soft creak of the floorboards as she went to her own room. But sleep would not come. He was trapped with the words from the diary, with the images they conjured, with the terrible conflict in his heart. He didn't know how much time had passed when he heard his door creak open. He sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept on the nightstand. A silhouette stood in the doorway, framed by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was Evelyn. "Jacob?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He said nothing, his heart hammering against his ribs. She took a hesitant step into the room. "I cannot bear your silence," she said, her voice cracking with a pain that lanced through him. "It is a sound I know too well. If I have displeased you, tell me. I will do better. Just do not shut me out." Her plea shattered his resolve. The suspicion, the fear, it all fell away, eclipsed by the sight of her standing before him, so utterly broken and afraid. He wasn't Jedediah. He would not be another man who hurt her with silence. "You haven't displeased me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He swung his legs out of bed and stood up. He was only in his undertrousers, and she in her plain white nightgown. They stood a few feet apart, two lost souls in the moonlit dark. "Then what is it?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. He didn't have an answer that he could give, so he closed the distance between them. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her tear-streaked cheeks. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a small, desperate sound escaping her lips. And then he was kissing her. It was nothing like their first kiss. This was not gentle or tender. This was a storm, a raw, desperate collision. It was a kiss born of his rage for what she had suffered and his shame for what he had suspected. It was fueled by her terror of abandonment and her starvation for a kind touch. It was a release of all the pent-up loneliness, grief, and fear that had haunted the corners of their small cabin. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him, and her hands came up to clutch at his shoulders as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bed. There were no gentle words, no slow seduction. It was a raw, frantic coming together, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death and pain. They moved together with an urgency that bordered on violence. Each touch, each gasp, each frantic kiss an attempt to burn away the past, to erase the ghosts that stood between them. For Jacob, it was an act of claiming, of protecting, of trying to physically stamp out the memory of another man's brutal touch. For Evelyn, it was a surrender, not of her will, but of her pain. A desperate hope that this man's passion could cauterize her wounds. They collapsed together in the aftermath, their bodies slick with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The silence that returned was different. It was heavy, intimate, filled with the enormity of what had just happened. Jacob lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his arms still wrapped around her. Evelyn was curled against his side, her head resting on his chest. He could feel the frantic, bird-like beat of her heart against his ribs. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The moon cast a pale, silvery light across the bed. He felt her shift, lifting her head to look at him. Her hair was a tangled mess around her shoulders, her eyes dark and unreadable pools in the dim light. She traced a single finger over his lips, then down his jaw, her touch feather-light and hesitant. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a raw, aching whisper that seemed to come from the deepest, most wounded part of her. "If you knew everything," she said, her gaze holding his, "if you knew all the dark things about me, would you still touch me like this?" He looked into her eyes and saw the terror of her past and the fragile hope for her future balanced on the point of his answer. He saw the woman from the diary, the prisoner, the survivor, and he saw the woman in his arms, his wife. The truth and the suspicion warred within him, a silent, brutal conflict. He opened his mouth to speak, to give her the reassurance she so desperately needed. But no words came. He remained silent. Jacob's silence was a wound. In the stark light of the morning after they had come together, it festered between them, more painful than any angry word could have been. Evelyn was a ghost at her own breakfast table, her movements small and furtive, her eyes downcast. She looked as though she expected a blow to fall at any moment. Jacob felt like a brute. He had taken what she offered in a moment of shared desperation and had given her nothing in return, not even the simple comfort of a word. The contents of her diary were a poison in his mind, twisting his pity into suspicion, his burgeoning love into a tangled knot of fear and doubt. He could not bring himself to touch her. The memory of their frantic, desperate coupling was a brand on his conscience. He had sought to erase her past, but instead, he had only become another man who took from her in the dark and offered her silence in the light. The chasm between them had not been bridged. It had become a raw, gaping wound. He needed to get away, to breathe air that wasn't thick with their shared misery. He mumbled an excuse about checking a downed fence line near the southern edge of his property and fled the cabin as if it were on fire. He rode Jericho hard, the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves a poor substitute for the clarity he sought. He was a simple man. He understood the language of the land, of cattle, of the weather. He did not understand the complexities of a woman's shattered soul, or the dark corners of a man's heart that could lead him to commit such atrocities as she had described. And he did not understand how to reconcile the fragile, gentle woman he knew with the potential killer who haunted the pages of her diary. The trip to Harmony Creek 2 days later was a necessity he could no longer avoid. Their supplies were dwindling, and the solitude of the ranch was becoming a pressure cooker. He hoped the mundane task of buying coffee and salt would somehow ground him. He did not ask Evelyn to join him. He could not bear the thought of the townsfolk's stares directed at her. Not now, when he could barely look at her himself. He noticed the change the moment he rode into town. The usual lazy quiet of a weekday morning was replaced by a low, humming tension. Small groups of men were clustered outside the saloon, their conversations stopping abruptly as he rode past. He saw women whispering behind their hands as they swept their porches. The eyes that followed him were no longer just curious. They were hard, speculative, and hostile. He dismounted in front of the general store, his senses on high alert. Inside, Martha, the storekeeper's wife, was serving another customer. She avoided his gaze, her movements brisk and unfriendly. When the other customer had left, she turned to Jacob, her arms crossed over her chest, her usual warm smile replaced by a thin, grim line. "What do you need, Jacob?" she asked, her tone clipped. "The usual. Martha, flour, coffee, salt." She began to gather the items in a stony silence. He could stand it no longer. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "What's got this whole town spooked?" She slammed a bag of flour onto the counter, sending up a small white cloud. "You mean you don't know?" she snapped. "He's been here for 2 days now. In the saloon, mostly. Buying drinks for anyone who listened to his sad story." "He? Who are you talking about?" "A man named Silas Kane," she said, her eyes boring into his. "A slick-looking fella, too well dressed for this part of the country. Says he's looking for his cousin, a poor, troubled girl who ran away from home after her husband. A good and godly man. Passed away from a tragic fall." Jacob's blood ran cold. Kane, the same name as the man in the diary. His cousin. "That's what he says," Martha continued, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Says the poor girl. Evelyn, her name wasn't right in the head, prone to fits and dark fancies. Says her husband, the Reverend Jedediah Kane, was a saint for putting up with her. And now, this Silas is just heartbroken, trying to find his lost kin and bring her back to what's left of her family." Martha paused, letting her words hang in the air. He also mentioned that a fair sum of money went missing from the Reverend's study right around the time she disappeared, and that the fall the Reverend took, well, it looked mighty suspicious to the folks who found him. The floor seemed to drop out from under Jacob. It was all there, a neat, plausible story that painted Evelyn as a mentally unstable, thieving, and likely murderous shrew. Silas had taken her secret and twisted it into a public condemnation. "He's lying," Jacob said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Is he?" Martha challenged. Her eyes narrowed. "You show up with a mail-order bride nobody's ever seen. A woman who won't even show her face in town, a woman with no past she's willing to talk about. Now her cousin shows up telling tales of theft and murder. You're a good man, Jacob Vance, but you are half mad with grief over Sarah. It looks to the whole town like you've been played for a fool by a black widow." He paid for his supplies, his hands moving with a stiff, wooden precision. He walked out of the store into the hostile sunlight, the weight of the town's judgment a physical blow. He saw him then, standing across the street, leaning against a post in front of the saloon. He was just as Martha had described, dressed in a black suit that was out of place in the dusty street, a silver-headed cane in his hand. He was smiling, a thin, predatory smirk, as he watched Jacob. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse, and in that moment, Jacob felt a primal hatred unlike anything he had ever known. This was not just a concerned relative. This was a wolf circling its prey. The ride home was a blur of dust and fury. The questions that had tormented him before now screamed for answers. He burst into the cabin, letting the door slam shut behind him. Evelyn, who was kneading dough on the table, jumped, her hands flying to her chest, her face pale with fright. "Jacob, what's wrong?" He strode toward her, his face a thunderous mask. He threw the sacks of flour and coffee onto the floor. "The truth, Evelyn," he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I want the truth, all of it, now!" She shrank back from him, her eyes wide with terror. It was the look of a cornered animal, a look he now understood she had worn for years. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," he roared, his control finally snapping. He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the tin plates. "A man is in town, a man named Silas Kane. He calls himself your cousin. He says your husband was a reverend named Jedediah. He says you ran after your husband died in a suspicious fall, and you took his money with you." All the color drained from her face. She looked as if he had physically struck her. She staggered back, her hand going to the wall for support. The carefully constructed composure she had maintained for weeks, for years, finally shattered, and she crumpled to the floor, her body racked with deep, silent sobs. The sight of her, so utterly broken at his feet, extinguished his rage like a bucket of water on a fire, leaving behind only the cold, sick feeling of shame. He knelt before her, his anger gone, replaced by a desperate need to undo the damage he had just done. "Evelyn," he said, his voice now gentle, aching. "Just tell me. I read the diary. I know what he did to you, but I have to hear it from you. I have to know what happened." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face a mask of betrayal and horror. "You read it?" she whispered. "You read my book." "I was looking for my ring," he said lamely. "I never should have, but I did, and now this man is in town, turning the whole world against you. I need to know who I'm fighting." She stared at him for a long moment, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Then, the story began to spill out of her, a torrent of pain and horror that had been dammed up for years. "Silas is not my cousin," she began, her voice a raw, broken whisper. He was Jedediah's nephew, and his creature, Jedediah called himself a reverend, but his church was this house, and his congregation was a collection of lost, broken women he gathered. He called us his flock. He would find girls like me, orphans, runaways, girls whose families had cast them out, and he would offer us sanctuary. He would promise food, shelter, and salvation. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "But it wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison. He used scripture to twist our minds. He taught us that our bodies were sinful, that our thoughts were wicked, that only through absolute submission to his will could we be made pure. He controlled everything, what we ate, when we slept, who we spoke to, and Silas. Silas was his enforcer. When a woman was defiant, Silas was the one who would drag her to the cellar. He enjoyed it. He would touch us. He said it was part of our penance." Jacob felt the sickness rise in his throat again, bitter and hot. This was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just one man's private cruelty. It was an organized system of abuse, hidden behind a veneer of religion. "The night he died?" she continued, her eyes unfocused, staring back into the horror of that memory. "Jedediah came to me. He had been growing more and more erratic. He spoke of a final sacrament. He said he was going to send me to God himself. He had a rope. I knew he was going to kill me. I don't know what happened. I just fought. I fought like a wild animal. I kicked and scratched and bit. Silas was supposed to be in the house, but he had gone into town. It was just Jedediah and me. I remember grabbing the heavy brass candlestick from the bedside table. I swung it. I think I hit him. I remember him falling. There was a terrible sound, a crack, and then a wetness." She looked down at her own hands as if seeing the blood there again. "I didn't check to see if he was alive. I didn't care. I just knew I had to run. I took the money from his desk, not because I wanted to steal, but because I knew I would need it to get away. to disappear. I ran out into the night and I never looked back. I swear to you. Jacob. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, desperate. I was trying to save my own life. I don't know if I killed him, but if I did, it was to stop him from killing me. The truth, in all its ugly, horrifying detail, settled in the room. He believed her, every word. The diary had given him the facts, but her confession gave him the soul of her story. He saw it all clearly now. The years of torment, the final, desperate act of survival. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please don't let them take me. Don't turn me over to the law. A court will never believe me. They will only see a runaway wife and a dead man of God. Silas will tell them I was mad. They will hang me. I don't want to die in a cage, in a place where no one can hear my voice." Her words, so full of a lifetime of being silenced, pierced him to the core. In that moment, everything became clear. The town, the law. What was right? What was wrong? None of it mattered. All that mattered was the terrified, broken, and incredibly brave woman kneeling before him. He had been wrestling with the question of whether he could love a killer, but he saw now that she wasn't a killer. She was a survivor, and he did not just care for her. He did not just admire her. He loved her. The realization was as swift and certain as a lightning strike, illuminating everything. He loved her deeply, fiercely, and completely. He reached down and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. He looked into her tear-filled eyes. "They won't take you," he said, his voice steady and sure. "No one will ever lock you in the dark again. I swear it." A fragile, disbelieving hope dawned in her eyes. "What will we do?" "We run," he said, his decision absolute. "Silas has turned the town against you. They'll form a posse before sundown. We have to leave, now." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. There was no time to pack belongings. No time for sentimental goodbyes to the home he had built. Survival was all that mattered. Jacob grabbed 2 rifles, stuffing his saddlebags with ammunition, a block of jerky, and a small bag of dried apples. He filled 2 canteens with water from the barrel. Evelyn, her face pale but her movements now imbued with a desperate purpose, wrapped 2 loaves of bread and a wedge of cheese in a cloth. He saddled Jericho and his other horse, a steady mare named Dust Devil. He helped Evelyn mount the mare, then swung himself up onto Jericho. He took one last look at the small cabin, the symbol of his grief and his solitude. And now, the scene of a love he had never expected to find. He had no idea if he would ever see it again. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers over the saddle. She gave a single, firm nod, her jaw set with a new resolve. He spurred Jericho forward, and they rode out, not towards the town, but east, towards the jagged, unforgiving wilderness of the Dragoon Mountains. They rode through the long afternoon, pushing the horses hard. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Jacob reined in his horse on a high ridge. He looked back toward the west. In the far distance, he could see them. A small, dark cluster of riders, like angry ants against the dying light. At their head, he imagined, was Silas Kane, leading a pack of men who believed they were dispensing justice. "They're coming," he said, his voice grim. A new fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Evelyn, but she did not waver. "Where can we go?" "Into the mountains," he said, his gaze fixed on the dark, formidable peaks ahead. "The land is rough, harder to track us. We'll ride through the night." And so they did. They plunged into a world of shadow and stone, the moon their only guide. They galloped across vast, open grasslands where the tall grass whispered around the horses' legs, their hoofbeats a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the plains. They navigated through groves of stunted oak and mesquite, the branches clawing at their clothes like skeletal hands. They splashed through the shallow, moon-slicked waters of a dry riverbed, the stones rolling and clattering underfoot, hoping the water would wash away their tracks. The pursuit was relentless. Several times, they thought they had lost them, only to hear the faint, baying cry of a hound or the distant shout of a man carried on the night wind. The chase was a desperate, primal thing. Jacob, with his intimate knowledge of the land, was their only advantage. He led them through narrow, winding canyons where the rock walls echoed the sound of their horses' labored breathing, and up steep, treacherous game trails that would have been impossible to navigate in daylight. Evelyn rode like a woman possessed, her slight form bent low over the mare's neck, her fear a tangible thing, but her resolve a shield. She was no longer the timid, hesitant woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. She was a woman fighting for her life, for her freedom, for the flicker of hope that this man beside her had ignited in her soul. Sometime before dawn, as they scrambled up a rocky incline, a shot rang out, echoing through the canyons. A bullet whined past Jacob's ear, smacking into the rock face beside him with a shower of sparks. The townsfolk were closer than he'd thought, guided by a tracker or simply by sheer, dogged determination. The chase had become a hunt, and they were the prey. The bullet's echo was a death knell in the pre-dawn stillness. Jacob reacted without thinking, shoving Evelyn's horse hard towards a narrow cleft in the rocks as another shot ripped through the air where she had just been. He spurred Jericho after her, plunging them into a darkness that smelled of damp stone and cold earth. The narrow passage twisted and turned, scraping their legs against the rough walls, before opening into a space of absolute blackness. It was a cave, deep and hidden. He could hear the posse thundering past the entrance, their shouts and the barking of their hound fading as they continued their pursuit up the mountain. For a long time, they didn't move, their horses heaving breaths and their own ragged gasps the only sound in the suffocating dark. Jacob slid from the saddle, his body aching with exhaustion. He helped Evelyn dismount. Her whole body was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that wasn't just from the cold. He led the horses deeper into the cave, his hand trailing along the wall, until they were certain they were out of sight of the entrance. "We'll rest here," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They'll think we kept going. We'll wait until dark." He found a relatively flat spot on the cave floor and helped her sit, her back against the cold stone. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light a violent intrusion in the ancient darkness. In the flickering light, he saw her face. It was chalk white, streaked with dirt and tears, and he saw something else. A long, deep scratch ran from her temple down her cheek, oozing blood. It must have happened in their frantic ride through the clawing mesquite branches. "You're hurt," he said, his voice tight with concern. "It's nothing," she whispered, but even as she said it, a shiver racked her body. He gently cleaned the wound with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, dabbing it with precious water from his canteen. She bore his touch without flinching, her eyes closed, her body slumping against the wall. He built a small, smokeless fire from the dry wood he found deeper in the cave. The little bit of warmth and light, a fragile shield against the oppressive cold and dark. They ate a little of the bread and jerky in silence, the events of the last 24 hours too enormous to put into words. When they were done, Evelyn curled up near the fire, pulling a saddle blanket around her thin shoulders. Jacob took the first watch, sitting with his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the sliver of gray light that marked the cave's entrance. By midday, he knew something was wrong. Evelyn was shivering violently, even huddled by the fire. He reached out and touched her forehead. It was burning hot. The scratch on her face was now an angry red, the skin around it puffy and swollen. Fever. The dirt and thorns of the desert had poisoned her blood. For the next 2 days, the world shrank to the size of that small, fire-lit cave. The posse was forgotten, the threat of Silas Kane a distant problem. Jacob's only focus was the woman shivering in the dark, He coaxed sips of water between her cracked lips. He bathed her face with cool, damp cloths. He sat by her side, a silent, helpless sentinel, as the fever raged. In her delirium, the walls she had so carefully constructed around her past crumbled to dust. She murmured names he didn't know, cried out in a language of fear and pain that was universal. She spoke to Jedediah, begging him to stop, her voice the terrified whimper of a trapped child. She spoke to Silas, her words laced with a venomous hatred, and sometimes she would surface from the feverish depths, her eyes wide and unfocused, and she would look at Jacob as if seeing him for the first time. "Jacob?" she would whisper, her hand reaching for his. "I'm here," he would answer, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "I'm right here." He held her hand, his large, calloused grip enveloping her small, feverish one, and he would talk to her for hours. He told her about Sarah, about their dream of building a life on that small patch of land. He told her about his loneliness, a silence so profound he thought it had swallowed him whole. He spoke of the day she arrived, a fragile ghost stepping down from the stagecoach, and how her quiet presence had filled the empty spaces in his home and in his heart. He didn't know if she could understand him, but he spoke anyway, laying his own soul bare in the darkness of the cave. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time. The swelling on her face had gone down, and though she was pale and weak, the fire was gone. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice a hoarse croak. "I told you I would," he said, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled him. He gave her a small sip of water. They were safe, for the moment. The enforced stillness of the cave became a strange sort of sanctuary, with the threat of the fever past, and the posse seemingly gone. A quiet intimacy grew between them. They talked, really talked, for the first time. She told him about her childhood, a quiet, bookish girl who dreamed of having a garden of her own, a dream that had turned to ash when her father sold her into bondage. One evening, as the fire cast long shadows on the cave walls, he asked her a question that had been forming in his mind. "If you could go back," he said softly, "before all of it, if you could have any life you wanted, what would you choose?" She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I don't think I ever allowed myself to dream that big," she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. "My dreams were small, a window that opened, a book he hadn't found and burned, the freedom to walk in the sun. Simple things." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes luminous in the firelight. "When I ran from him, I wasn't running toward a new life. I was just running away from death. For a long time, after I escaped, I thought it might have been better if he had succeeded. The world was so large and I was so alone. I thought about ending it, finding a quiet place and just letting go." Her confession hung in the air, a testament to the depths of her despair. Jacob's heart ached for her. "But then," she continued, a small, sad smile touching her lips, "I saw your letter. It was so plain, so honest. There were no grand promises, no flowery words, just the simple truth of a lonely man on a piece of land. And I thought, maybe that is a quiet place I can go. Not to die, but to be invisible, to be left alone." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the rough, sun-weathered line of his jaw. "I didn't expect kindness. I didn't expect to feel safe. You, Jacob, you made me want to live again." His throat was thick with emotion. He could not speak. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held all the tenderness and reverence that their first frantic coupling had lacked. It was a kiss of healing, a quiet promise in the dark. That night, as she slept soundly for the first time in days, her breathing deep and even, Jacob took the small, cloth-bound diary from his saddlebag. He had grabbed it in their haste, thinking it was the only piece of her he could not leave behind. He sat by the fire, the book open on his knee. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He had her story now, from her own lips. This book was a record of her pain, a testament to her prison. It was a chain that still bound her to Jedediah Cain, with a sense of solemn purpose. He tore the first page from the book and dropped it into the flames. He watched the elegant script blacken and curl into ash, page by page. He fed her history to the fire. He was erasing the words of the monster who had tormented her, destroying the physical evidence of her years in hell. When the last page was gone, he threw the worn blue cover into the embers. This was his choice. He was choosing her, the living, breathing woman beside him, over the ghost that haunted these pages. If they survived this, they would start with a clean slate, a future unwritten. Their sanctuary was shattered the next morning. A dislodged rock, sent tumbling down the mountainside by a foraging deer, clattered past the mouth of the cave. It was enough. A sharp whistle cut through the morning air, followed by a shout. "Over here! I found their horses!" They had been discovered. Silas and his men had not given up. They had simply been searching, methodically combing the mountainside. There was no time to think. Jacob doused the fire, saddled the horses with frantic speed, and pushed Evelyn toward the cave's entrance. "Ride!" he yelled. "Don't stop for anything!" They burst out of the cave into the blinding sunlight and a hail of gunfire. The posse was spread out below them, a line of grim-faced men. Jacob and Evelyn spurred their horses, not down, but up, scrambling for the higher ground, their only hope to outrun the men on the treacherous terrain. It was a desperate, final chase. Bullets whined past them, kicking up dust and rock. They galloped along a narrow ridge, the ground dropping away hundreds of feet on either side. Jacob stayed slightly behind and to the side of Evelyn, his own body a shield for hers. He saw one of the riders, a man with a Sharps rifle, take careful aim, not at him, but at Evelyn. "Evelyn, get down!" he roared. He spurred Jericho hard, ramming his horse into the side of her mare, pushing them both away from the line of fire just as the rifle cracked. He felt a white-hot, searing pain tear through his left shoulder. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, knocking him from the saddle. He landed hard on the rocky ground, his head smacking against a stone. The world exploded into a starburst of pain and then tilted into a dizzying gray fog. The last thing he saw was Evelyn's terrified face as she wheeled her horse around and galloped back toward him. When he came to, the world was a throbbing, blurry mess. He was slumped over the front of his saddle, his arms tied loosely to the horn to keep him from falling off. Evelyn was leading Jericho, her face a mask of frantic determination. The sounds of the posse were gone. They had escaped, but he was badly wounded. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood, and every jostle of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through him. "We have to stop," he rasped, his throat raw. "I'm no good to you like this." "No," she said, her voice fierce, resolute. "We don't stop, they'll find us." But by nightfall, he was fading, his body shivering with blood loss and shock. Evelyn found a small, sheltered arroyo and helped him to the ground. She tore open his shirt. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, but the wound was bleeding profusely. She packed it with the cleanest cloth she had, her face pale and grim in the moonlight. He was dying. They both knew it. They couldn't outrun the posse, and he couldn't survive much longer without a doctor. A profound despair settled over them. After everything they had been through, it was going to end here, in a dusty ditch in the middle of nowhere. And then, a memory sparked in Evelyn's mind, a story Jacob had told her in the cave, a rambling tale about his early days on the ranch. "The lawyer," she said suddenly, her eyes wide. "The one you told me about? Judge Miller. You said you pulled him out of a flash flood, saved his life." Jacob looked at her through a haze of pain. "Old man Miller," he breathed. "He's in Harmony Creek." "Can he be trusted?" she asked, her voice urgent. "He's a hard man. Jacob mumbled, his head lolling. "But an honest one. He owes me." A desperate plan formed in Evelyn's mind. It was insane, it was suicide, but it was their only chance. She was no longer just running, she was fighting back. Leaving Jacob hidden in the arroyo with a canteen of water and a rifle he was too weak to lift, she mounted the mare. She rode not away from Harmony Creek, but towards it, a lone woman on a desperate mission. She skirted the main part of the town, using the darkness as her cover, and found the small, respectable house with a polished brass sign that read, Atticus Miller, Attorney at Law. With her heart pounding in her throat, she knocked on the door. After a long moment, it was opened by a stern-looking man with a shock of white hair and eyes as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. He held a lamp, which he raised to her face. "What is it?" he grumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Judge Miller," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "My name is Evelyn Vance. I am Jacob Vance's wife. He's been shot. He saved your life once. Now I'm asking you to save his and mine." The old lawyer's eyes narrowed, taking in her disheveled appearance, the dried blood on her cheek, the terror and resolve warring in her eyes. He was silent for a full minute, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were reading every page of her soul. "Get him," the judge said finally, his voice firm. "Bring him to my barn. And then, girl, you and I are going to talk. If there's to be a trial, you will tell me everything." The next day, with Jacob lying on a cot in the back of the lawyer's barn, delirious with fever while the town's doctor gruffly tended to his wound, a preliminary hearing was convened in the saloon. Word had spread like wildfire. The runaway wife had returned. Evelyn stood before Sheriff Brody and a room packed with the hostile, curious faces of the townsfolk. Silas Kane was there, a look of smug triumph on his face. He stood with the posse, the heroes who had hunted down the dangerous fugitive. "Well, Mrs. Vance," Sheriff Brody said, his voice weary, "you've caused a whole heap of trouble. Silas Kane here says you murdered your husband, the Reverend Jedediah Kane." Evelyn took a deep breath. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the ranchers who had called her a whore, the women who had whispered behind their hands. Then she met Silas's cold, reptilian gaze. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time in her life, it was eclipsed by a burning, righteous anger. She would not be silent, not anymore. "My husband is dead," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the suddenly silent room. "And I may have been the one to kill him. I will not deny that." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas smiled. "But before you pass judgment," Evelyn continued, her voice rising in strength, "you will hear how he died. You will hear about the man who called himself a reverend. You will hear about his prison of piety, his cellar of salvation, and the unspeakable cruelties he committed in the name of God." She looked directly at the crowd, her eyes blazing. "You think you are hunting a murderer, but I am here to tell you that the real monster is the one who is already in his grave." Her words fell like a stone into the quiet saloon. The smug look on Silas's face faltered. The murmuring in the crowd started again, but this time it was different. It was no longer a uniform hum of condemnation. It was the sound of a town beginning to question, to wonder. The sound of a town, for the first time, splitting into two. Evelyn's words hung in the saloon's smoky air, heavy and sharp as a headsman's axe. The room, which moments before had been a cauldron of condemnation, fell into a stunned, profound silence. The men of the posse, who had ridden out with the righteous certainty of lawmen, now shifted on their feet, their gazes flickering from Evelyn's defiant face to the suddenly sweating visage of Silas Kane. It was Atticus Miller who broke the spell. He stepped forward from the back of the room, his old, stooped frame radiating an authority that decades in the courtroom had forged. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Sheriff Brody," he began, his voice a dry crackle that commanded attention. My client has made a statement, a serious one, and as it happens, I have spent the last 36 hours making inquiries based on the information she provided me. Silas Kane scoffed, his composure returning in a wave of oily arrogance. Inquiries, based on the ravings of a hysterical woman? This is a farce. She admits she may have killed her husband. Arrest her. Miller fixed Silas with a gaze as cold and sharp as a winter morning. Hysterical, you say? It's a convenient label for a woman whose story you don't wish to hear, isn't it, Mr. Kane? You see, the problem with your narrative, that of a saintly reverend and his unhinged wife, is that the Reverend Jedediah Kane seems to have made a habit of collecting unhinged women. The lawyer turned to face the crowd. I sent a wire to the marshal in Prescott, where the late Reverend maintained his institution. I asked for any information regarding runaways or missing persons from his so-called sanctuary over the past decade. The marshal's reply was illuminating. He held up a telegram. He lists 4 names, 4 young women, all from troubled backgrounds, who were taken in by the Reverend and subsequently vanished without a trace. Their families were told they had been sent to sister missions back east. They never arrived. A low murmur rippled through the room. Silas's face had gone pale. Lies! Slander from a provincial lawman who knows nothing! Perhaps, Miller conceded, a grim smile touching his lips. But what about a witness who is not a provincial lawman? What about someone who is right here, in this room? He scanned the crowd, his hawk-like eyes seeming to pierce every face. Is there a Mrs. Agnes Muller here? I was told she runs the seamstress shop at the edge of town. At the back, a thin, timid woman with haunted eyes and hands twisted by arthritis flinched as if struck. All eyes turned to her. She looked like she might bolt, but her husband, a stout blacksmith, put a steadying hand on her arm. Speak up, Agnes, Miller said, his voice softening with an unexpected gentleness. You told me your story last night. Tell them. Agnes Muller took a shaky breath, her eyes darting to Silas Kane with a look of pure terror. Before I married my Joseph, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I was alone. My family had passed. I had nowhere to go. A man, the Reverend Kane, he found me. He offered me a home. Her voice broke. He called it a sanctuary, but it was like Mrs. Vance said, a prison. He would lock us in the cellar for the smallest infraction. He said it was to cleanse our souls. She began to weep. Quiet, painful sobs. I was lucky. I got away one night when he was traveling. I ran and I never looked back. I was too ashamed, too scared to ever tell anyone. Until now. Agnes's testimony was a lightning bolt that cracked the foundation of Silas's story. Suddenly, Evelyn was not a lone, hysterical woman. She was a survivor, and there were others. And what of you, Mr. Kane? Miller's voice was like steel again, all gentleness gone as he turned on Silas. My client tells me you were the Reverend's enforcer, that you took a particular interest in the punishment of these women. Silas sputtered, his face a mask of rage and panic. This is an outrage. I was a dutiful nephew helping my ailing uncle manage his charitable works. Is that so? Miller said, taking a step closer. Then perhaps you can explain this. He unrolled a piece of paper, a crudely drawn map. This is a layout of the Reverend's house, drawn from memory by my client. She has marked a specific room, a small, soundproofed room behind a false wall in the cellar, a room with chains on the wall, a room she says you were particularly fond of. Miller's eyes narrowed. The marshal in Prescott is on his way to the Kane property with this map and a crowbar. What do you think he will find? Mr. Kane? Silas Kane's arrogant facade finally shattered. Pure animal panic flared in his eyes. He took a step back, then another, his gaze darting toward the door. That was all the confirmation the crowd needed. The men who had ridden with him in the posse now looked at him with dawning horror and revulsion. He was not the avenger of a murdered man of God. He was a jailer and a predator. In that moment, Silas broke. He shoved two men aside and bolted for the saloon doors. He was fast, but Sheriff Brody, old and weary as he was faster. He stuck out a leg, and Silas went sprawling into the dusty street. Before he could scramble up, the blacksmith, Mr. Muller, was on him, his huge hands gripping the front of Silas's fine suit coat, his face a mask of cold fury for the terror his wife had endured. The verdict, when it came, was a formality, with Silas Kane under arrest and awaiting the arrival of the U.S. Marshal, and with Agnes Muller's corroborating testimony. The case against Evelyn fell apart. Judge Miller argued passionately that Jedediah Kane's death was a clear and unequivocal act of self-preservation. Sheriff Brody, looking profoundly weary of the whole affair, declared that there was insufficient evidence to charge Evelyn with any crime. She was free. The return to the ranch was a quiet, surreal journey. Jacob, his arm bound tightly in a sling, rode beside her, his face pale but his eyes clear. The townspeople watched them go, their expressions a mixture of shame, pity, and awe. They had set out from this town as fugitives, hunted and condemned. They returned as survivors, trailing the wreckage of a dark secret they had dragged into the light. The homestead was just as they had left it, a silent testament to their frantic departure. A fine layer of dust covered everything. It felt like a lifetime ago. For a long while, they simply stood in the main room, the silence between them no longer fraught with tension or suspicion, but filled with a deep, quiet understanding. They had been to hell and back, together. They had seen the darkest parts of each other's souls, his doubt, her trauma, and had come through it not broken, but forged anew in the fire. The days that followed were a time of healing, both for Jacob's body and for their shared spirit. His wound was clean, but deep, and it left him unable to do the heavy work the ranch demanded. And so, the roles reversed. Evelyn became the caregiver, the provider. She tended to his wound with a gentle, practiced hand. She managed the small herd of cattle, her initial apprehension giving way to a quiet competence. She chopped wood, her slight frame surprisingly strong, her movements fueled by a fierce, protective love. Jacob would watch her from his chair on the porch, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. He saw her not as a victim, not as a mail-order bride, but as his partner, his equal, a woman of astonishing resilience and strength. They talked for hours, filling in the silent spaces that had once defined their relationship. He learned about her love for poetry, a passion Jedediah had deemed sinful. She learned about his clumsy attempts to bake bread after Sarah died, attempts that had always ended in something closer to a rock than a loaf. They laughed, a sound that had been absent from the small cabin for too long. One afternoon, as he sat watching her work, he saw her stop and stare at the neglected patch of earth that had once been Sarah's garden. Her face held a familiar, wistful expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "Just that it's a good piece of land," she said quietly. "Good sun. It would be a fine place for flowers." The next time the supply wagon made its weekly round, Jacob bought a small pouch from the driver. That evening, he called her out to the garden patch. The sun was setting, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. He pressed the small cloth pouch into her hand. She opened it. Inside were dozens of tiny seeds. "What are they?" she whispered. "Delphiniums," he said, his voice soft. "And lupines, and columbine. I told the driver to bring me seeds for flowers that grow tall, flowers that reach for the sky." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the seeds to his face. He had remembered. He had listened to her smallest, most forgotten dream. It was a gift more precious than gold, a promise of beauty and life in a land that was so often harsh and unforgiving. Together, they worked the soil, He, with his one good arm, broke up the hard, dry earth with a small trowel. She followed behind him, her fingers carefully pressing the tiny seeds into the ground, a silent prayer for each one. They were planting not just a garden, but a future. They were sowing hope into the very land that had witnessed so much of their pain. That night, a profound peace settled over the small cabin. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and though the scars remained, they no longer had the power to haunt. They sat before the fire, the comfortable silence a warm blanket around them. Jacob watched the firelight play across her face, illuminating the faint scar on her cheek, a silver reminder of their flight. To him, it was not a mark of damage, but a badge of survival. She turned to him, her gray eyes soft and deep. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only a love so pure and complete it took his breath away. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart, just as she had done on that long-ago stormy night. But this time, her touch was not a question. It was a statement. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss that held none of the frantic desperation of their first time, none of the sorrow of their past. It was a slow, deep, and knowing kiss, a celebration of everything they had survived, everything they had become. She took his hand and led him to the bedroom, her movements filled with a quiet, confident grace. In the soft moonlight that streamed through the window, she came to him not as a duty-bound wife, not as a grateful survivor, but as a woman whole and complete, freely giving and receiving a love that was absolute. Their coming together was a quiet, sacred act, a final, definitive burning away of old ghosts and old pains. It was a dance of two souls who had found in each other's arms the only sanctuary that had ever truly mattered. Afterward, she lay curled against him, her head resting in the hollow of his good shoulder. The moonlight traced a silver path across the floor. He could feel the slow, steady beat of her heart against his own. She lifted her head and looked at him, her face serene in the pale light. A small, beautiful smile touched her lips. "I'm no longer a ghost. Jacob," she whispered, her voice full of a strength and peace that seemed to resonate from the very core of her being. "I'm your wife." He pulled her closer, his heart too full for words. Outside, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the western sky stretched out, dotted with a million diamond-sharp stars. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a lonely and ancient sound. The land was still harsh, still wild, but inside the small wooden cabin, bathed in the soft, hopeful glow of the moon, two souls had found their home. They had found their peace. They had found their beginning. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment down below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and be sure to share your thoughts on Jacob and Evelyn's journey.